Hi, I'm Bob Demlong with the Phoenix Police Department, and with me today is Mike Nicklin, our Police Museum Curator, and we're here to talk with Carroll Cooley, who is a retired captain from our police department and also was an officer back in the 1960s involved in the Miranda case.
Well, I was a detective for only about a year when this case came up. I had started out in, like most new detectives, in property detail, which is where a lot of paperwork, not much results. I worked there for a while, and then I was moved over to the crimes against persons detail. And that's where I was working when I was assigned the investigation on Miranda. Still a young man, 27 years old, assigned to the persons detail under Sergeant Seymour Nealis. I was assigned a case on the 4th, I believe it was, the 4th of March. It was a Monday. I came to work on the day shift, and I was given a case which involved a young lady being kidnapped off of the street, being forcibly raped, and then robbed of the money she had. I was the only officer assigned to that case. And so at this point, I proceeded to read the reports, gather what information I could, make an appointment to talk to the victim, which is just SOP, standard policy. Had an appointment to talk with her. She was 18 years old. She was very shy, reserved person, pretty naive, and so I went to talk to her, found out what happened beyond what was written in the initial report, because when this occurred on the 3rd of March, she went home after this occurrence, this rape, this kidnapping, and the police were called. And when the police came, first off a patrol officer, and he determined that it was a serious crime. Then he called the detective bureau, and Officer Gordo and Davis responded as night detectives and took the initial investigation. And that's the reason on Monday morning I had a report written by Officer Gordo. After I talked to her, I went over the report with her, got a little further information, not a lot. Mostly everything had been covered very thoroughly by the detectives. She was able to add a little bit to the report. The vehicle had light brown, vertical striped upholstery. The incident itself happened like this. On the 2nd of March, she was working at the Paramount Theater. She was a cashier and ticket taker and doing whatever else needed to be done. She got off work around 11:30. She and a fellow employee, a young male, walked from the Paramount Theater, which is at 2nd Street and Adams, still there, maybe called the Orpheum now. It's had a couple different names. They walked to the bus station, where they boarded a bus for North Phoenix. She got off the bus alone. The young man that walked with her and worked with her, he was going somewhere else further up the line. As she got off the bus and started walking to her place of abode, which happened to be a married sister and her family who lived on Citrus Way, this was at 7th Street in Marlatt, a car pulled out from a strip mall, which is on the northeast corner of that address. The scene here is that the street is unlit. There's large overhanging trees, a narrow 2-lane road, no curbs. As I recall, there was a vacant field on the north side of that street. The vehicle pulled ahead of her, and a guy got out of the car. She had to walk out into the street to walk around the car, and when she did, a man grabbed her, held something sharp to her neck, she assumed was a knife, told her, "Do not scream, and you will not get hurt." He put her in the back seat of the car. He tied her hands and her ankles with a couple pieces of rope. She was crying. She was pleading with him. She was very, very upset. begging him to let her go. She told him that she was a virgin because his intentions were pretty clear. And he just told her to be quiet, cooperate, and she wouldn't get hurt. They left there driving east and then north, and somewhere 20 minutes or so driving time away out into a remote area. He then got out of the car. By this time, she had removed her bindings, the ropes, and he told her to get undressed. She refused, and so he undressed her. He then got partially undressed, or maybe completely undressed, I don't remember now. And he proceeded to molest her. He tried to make penetration at the beginning and was unsuccessful, but then he tried a second time and he was successful. He finished the act and told her to get her clothes back on, and he'd take her back where he got her. He did take her back to that particular location, close, not to the same location. He let her out of the car, but he says, "You have any money?" She says, "I have $3 or $4. He said, "Well, give me your money."
Give me your money. Whether you tell your mother or not about this, it's up to you, but pray for me.
So she gave him the money, and he said, "Whether you tell your mother or not about this is up to you, but pray for me." She ran home, crying, hysterical. She told her sister what happened. That's when the detectives came to the scene shortly after that. They took her to the hospital for an examination. This is what happened in the crime itself. So I reviewed all of these things with her because some of it was in the report and some of it was not. It was pretty much the end of that day. I don't recall any other significant activity occurring on that Monday. But during that week, there was some discrepancies in her story that bothered me. One of the things that bothered me as a detective and being suspicious of everybody and everything that people tell you and not believing a lot, I thought maybe she had been involved with this young man, which she kind of had a crush on. Turns out there was nothing to that, but maybe there was more to the story than she was telling us. I asked her about the route that they took, the car drive out to the remote area. And there was some discrepancies in streets and where he went through and so forth. Because of these things, I might want her to take a polygraph. I talked to her older sister, and that's where I learned that she was very shy and withdrawn, and possibly a little slow mentally, maybe, even though I did not detect that myself. The polygraph came back inconclusive. It was during a period of time when she was having her period and she was taking some medication, and so the results of that were somewhat unreliable. At that particular time, in bringing her downtown, another officer, Richard Golden, and I went out because that was policy. You'd have two officers when you were going to have a female in the car. So on the way back to her home, I asked her to see if she could identify a car that would look like the suspect vehicle. And that's where it became very obvious to me that she didn't know one car from another. She'd first pick a Ford or a Chevy or a Dodge or a Nash. She just couldn't tell. So anyway, with this description we had of a car, which was light green in color, this vertical upholstery, we didn't have a whole lot to go on. By the end of the week, and understand also as a detective, you're not just working one case. I still had other cases that I was making phone calls on and doing some background investigations on. But during the course of that week, nothing else developed. So on the weekend, there was an incident that happened, which was very significant. She was still going to work at the Paramount. She was still taking the same bus home. But in the meantime, she was very afraid to walk home alone on Marlette. That was about 3 or 4 blocks to their home. There was another relative that happened to be visiting. His name was Paul. And Paul was, during this past week, just going on, he had been going down to the bus stop and meeting her and walking her home in this dark hour of the day, shortly after midnight, usually the time the bus got there. Well, Paul was at the bus stop waiting. He noticed a car driving slowly in the area. He noticed it again on Marlette. One person in the car aroused his suspicion, so to speak. He took note of the license plate mentally as DFL 312. Patricia got off of the bus. They started walking home. He saw the car on a side street, and he asked Patricia if that looked like the car. And they started walking toward the car, and the car started up and sped away. And Patricia says, yeah, it looks like the car. But you understand, she didn't know one car from another. So anyway, they went on to the house. They called the police. A patrol officer arrived. He gave the information, DFL 312. And that evening, they proceeded to check that car out. They found it registered to an Oldsmobile on the west side of Phoenix. Sent an officer by. The Oldsmobile was sitting in the driveway or carport. They inquired about the car. It belonged to an elderly couple. There was nobody else there to drive the car. The car hadn't been driven that evening. So the supplement came to me Monday morning. That was the 11th of March. Taking that supplement, I then went to see Paul and interview him. The thing that he told me, that he wasn't sure about the numbers, but he was sure about the prefix, the letters. He also was sure of one other thing. He was sure that the car that he saw was a Packard. He thought it was a 1953 Packard. The reason he was so sure about that was he had a friend with a similar car, a 53 Packard. Taking that information, I asked him to go with me. We went down to a dealership, which was Otis Bacon, which long since gone, but he was on Indian School, and I think he later sold Mercedes, but at one time he sold Packards and Studebakers. And so we asked if he had any old Packards in the yard, and he said he did, directed us to the yard out in back of the dealership. We found a 1953 four-door Packard, and Paul identified that as being, yes, the same kind of vehicle that he saw on that night, which would have been the early morning hours of Sunday the 10th. Taking that information, then I took him home, went back to the office, contacted Motor Vehicle Division, asked them to run all license numbers with DFL and see if they had anything registered to a Packard. Those days it wasn't too quick to do that. They didn't have the computers, so it was a hand count. Either the next day or that day, I got the information back that the car was registered to a Twyla Hoffman on LeBaron Street in Mesa, Arizona. The license number on the one that registered at the MVD was DFL 317. There was only one number off. So I talked to my supervisor. He said, I want you to take another officer with you. So Officer Wilford Young, Bill Young, as we called him, he and I went to Mesa. When we got there, we went to the LeBaron address, and the house was vacant. So we canvassed the neighborhood, and we found that there had been a young man and his wife with 3 children, a baby and a couple other small children, and they called him Ernie, Miranda, and his wife Twyla. They also told me they had just moved that weekend, a couple days before I was there. He moved in a United Produce truck. From there, Bill Young and I went to the Mesa Police Department, and we ran the name by young Mexican male, Hispanic male, name of Ernest Miranda. And there was a history on a person by that name. In fact, I think the history, if I remember, the FBI report listed him as Ernest Garcia Miranda. The history on this young person was that in 1956, as a juvenile, he had been charged with assault to commit rape and had been sent to Fort Grant, juvenile incarceration place, and had spent a year there. He had been arrested in Los Angeles for a robbery, also as a delinquent, 17 years old. From there, he had a record where he was in the service, got a bad discharge, spent some time in the stockade, had some other arrests, vagrancy in Texas, and most significantly, he had been charged and convicted of the Dyer Act, stolen car across the state line, in Tennessee, and spent a year in federal prison. Now, we still don't know if, the guy that we're looking for at that address is the same person. So taking that information and that day being pretty much over by then, we went back to the office, and I don't recall, oh, I know, we did stop at United Produce and we asked them about the truck and the person working there, and they said yes, they had an Ernie Miranda. He worked there at night on the dock, and they did loan him the truck to move. They did not know where he had moved to. I don't recall at this time, this is only like 44 years ago. I don't recall whether we went to the post office at Fillmore right then or whether we went the next morning. But when we did go, we did get a change of address that had just come in on an Ernie Miranda from LeBaron Street in Mesa to a west side address on Mariposa, over close to the freeway. With that information, Bill Young and I then proceeded to this Mariposa address. And when we got there, we noticed that there was a Packard, apparently 1953, had a license plate DFL 317, and as we walked up to the door, I looked into the back of the car and I could see that the upholstery was light brown vertical upholstery. We knocked on the door. A young woman come to the door, mid-30s. She was carrying a baby. We identified ourselves as police officers, and we asked if there was an Ernie Miranda that lived at this address, and she said yes, there was. He was asleep. We asked if we could speak with him. Would she wake him up? And she said yes. So she left, and we were still outside standing at the door, and she went into the house, came back a few moments, and said he'll be right here. And he arrived immediately. He had no shirt on, no shoes, wearing a pair of khaki pants, and obviously had been sleeping. He asked us, what's this about? And we said, well, it's a police matter. We'd like to talk to you about it. So he said, well, come on in. So he invited us into the house, and we walked in the house, and there was a couple other children there. He said, well, what's going on? And we said, we'd like to speak to you somewhere besides in the presence of your family here. It concerns a police investigation, and we need to talk to you. Would you mind coming with us to the police department? He says, no, I don't mind. He said, let me get dressed. So we stood in the middle of the living room. He went into the bedroom. In a few moments, he came out wearing some shoes and combed his hair and had a t-shirt on. We then went to the car. He was not under arrest. I emphasize this because there was some opinions by the Supreme Court that we arrested him. We went to the car. He was not handcuffed. He sat in the back seat. Bill Young sat in the passenger side. I drove. So this is not police procedure. If he had been under arrest, he would have been handcuffed. He would have been placed on the passenger side in the rear seat, and the other officer would have been behind the driver in order to protect the driver in case there was any kind of a problem. So it was obvious he's not under arrest. On the way to the station, he asked about it. We said, why don't we wait until we get there and we'll talk about it. And Bill Young specifically said, you know, if you don't want to talk to us, you don't have to. Now, that's all we ever mentioned. It was not required by law or practice to advise people of their rights. You were assumed to know your rights. Everybody had civic classes in school, you know, just like people are assumed to know it's against the law to steal. I mean, you don't have to tell them it's against the law to steal. They know it's against the law. It's a basic thing. So anyway, that's beside the point at this point.
As you were talking about earlier, you were saying that on the way back to town, Miranda was in the back seat and Young was in the passenger seat, and he had said something to Miranda. What was that?
He told him that he didn't have to talk to us about this if he didn't want to.
Okay.
We kind of made it clear to him also that at the conclusion of our interview, if nothing had developed, we didn't pin this down because we didn't want to talk about the case yet. And so we didn't tell him what case we were talking about, but we did say if nothing developed, we'll bring you home. It was pretty much understood. We were there to interview him. We went on to the department. We got there, we went into interrogation room 2, or interview room 2, they would call it today. It's a small room in the Detective Bureau, Crimes Against Person Detail, and I would just guess it's 10 or 12 foot by 10 or 12 foot, somewhere in that neighborhood, kind of a square room. There was a table, about 3 chairs. We brought him into the room. There was also a mirror, a one-way mirror that you could see into the room but couldn't see out. It was a mirror on the inside and a see-through on the outside, and it was where we held lineups. He sat down, and I sat across the table from him, and Bill sat on my right, and we began to question him, and starting with there had been a crime. I kind of gave him a little background that there had been a young lady picked up off of the street, also using mild terms, you know, instead of harsh terms. They had gone out into the desert where they had intercourse, and then he brought her home. He denied that. I didn't give him any real close details because you don't want to give away your investigation and let him pick up on things you're trying to tell him that he parrots back to you. He denied it. I told him we had traced him through the license plate on his car, so we knew he was the suspect. Of course, we didn't know that, but we had some suspicions. We told him he met the physical description, which in fact he did. We talked, and it was a very friendly, congenial type of interview. It was not harsh. It was no good cop, bad cop type of thing. Remember now, we only had a guy that we thought might have been in the area a week later, not the night of the crime. We didn't have a lot to go on because, you know, the car was a different color. The license plate was a different license plate. And it was a week after the crime had been committed. So it was kind of thin. Otherwise, it's not the kind of proof that you would need to make an arrest. He denied everything. We brought up his record, of course. We had acquired that record from Mesa, and we knew he had a juvenile record. We knew that he had been charged with an attempt to commit rape, assault with intent to commit rape. We knew that he had spent time for that. We knew he was an ex-con with a federal record. And all these things were brought up and mentioned to him, but he denied. Our interview only lasted about 30 minutes. It was not a real long interview. He denied everything. And like I said, it was friendly. We asked him if he minds standing in a lineup. He agreed to stand in a lineup. So while we arranged for the lineup, Bill went up and got 3 other Hispanic males about the same description. I made arrangements to get as many victims in as we could find because there had been a whole series of these kinds of crimes in the downtown area in and around the Paramount Theater. There's a phone company where women often worked, and there had been several in that area that had been accosted. I don't know how many crimes there had been in that area, but we did know that there had been a person working it, and a lot of them were robberies, taking money from women. So we were able to get my particular case, and we were able to get Barbara Sue, who had been robbed of $8. The person had intended to rape her, had got into her car, driven her to another location, an alley, and was trying to force himself upon her. She talked him out of it, and he took her money and left. We also knew that there was another case, which a lady had been approached in the same area. A guy tried to get in her car, and she screamed, and another car came by, and the person fled. That particular description on that case was Hispanic male, and he had a tattoo. It was EM on his hand. Now, at this point, he's denied everything. So the lineup was conducted, the 3 other males. We got the 2 people we could contact on short notice. The other lady that had the incident identifying the tattoo, we weren't able to find her at that short notice. Besides, it was a robbery. I had no interest in that. I was interested in my case. But anyway, we would have if we could have found her. So we then conducted the lineup, 4 people. Ernie picked number 1 in the lineup. His picture's right here. Number 1, he's wearing the tag around his neck. And we brought in the victim of my case, Patricia. She viewed the lineup. She said it looked like the number 1 guy. I asked her if she was sure. No, she wasn't sure. I asked her if you're positive. No. One of the things we do, and at least at that time, is you make sure you have a positive ID. She said she might be able to identify a person if she heard his voice. So we removed her from that room and brought in Barbara Sue. Her case had been in November 27th, I believe it was, of 1962, the lady that had talked her way out of being raped. She viewed the lineup. Once again, she said it looks like the guy the number one guy, but once again, she would not make a positive identification. And that, and I might add, is not unusual, as you probably know, because people are really reluctant to make a positive ID for fear they may identify the wrong person. We then took her out of the room, concluded the lineup. Bill took the 3 prisoners back to the jail, which is just upstairs. When he got back, the 2 of us went in, as I recall. Whether it was just me or with him, and he came in later, I don't know for sure, but I think we were both at that time. I went in and I didn't say anything at all to Ernie because I didn't really know quite what to say. I did not have a good ID. I had circumstantial evidence only, which was thin, and in my opinion, would not have warranted an arrest because I didn't think we could get a conviction on the thin evidence that we did have, the circumstantial evidence. Later on, we might have been able to pin him down through the sperm, possibly, but that was too early on this case because this is a week later and we didn't have the results back from the lab at the hospital. Those are things that we might have been able to do follow-up. But at this point, I didn't have a case, but I did feel like I had the right, suspect. But I didn't say anything, and I was wondering what exactly I was going to say and what we were going to do next. And when Ernie asked me this question, how did I do? And I looked at him and says, well, you didn't do so good, Ernie. You didn't do so good. And Ernie said to me, well, I guess I better tell you about it then. And I said, yes, I think you should. He then described exactly what happened. And of course, his story is a little different, but it was basically the same. He didn't like to use the terms like force and so forth, like when he talked about tying her hands and ankles, but when he talked about the act, he says she didn't resist, it was with cooperation, This is his rationalization, obviously. So anyway, told me about that. Now, he knew that we had 2 lineups, and we'd asked him about the second one, where we had the barber in. And so, thinking he had been identified on both of them, he then told us about that. He also told us about the tattoo, the girl that had been accosted on February of '63. And so, I asked him would he give us a written confession? I have that confession in my file over here if anybody wants to see it. It was a witness suspect statement in the Phoenix Police Department form. And it said, you're giving this statement free and voluntary without any promises of immunity, etc. And you sign off on that, which he did. He gave his written description. Now, the guy had an 8th grade education. He had no accent. He was really a rather smart guy. His writing is quite good. The spelling was excellent. The grammar was not so good, but he abbreviated it. He shortened things, kind of like they do now on, text messaging or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
He gave us a full written confession. At that time, when it was all over, I said, you're under arrest for the rape, robbery, and kidnapping of Patricia and the robbery of Barbara Sue. And we booked him into the jail, and that is the case. Now, later we went to trial, which I'll talk about.
Why don't you tell us more about that? Obviously now you have the case. What you see is a solid case, and now it's going to trial, and it probably you never expected it to go as long as it did and as far as it did.
No.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Bob, we depended very much on confessions. We didn't have all of the scientific sophistication that police departments have today, DNA and all this kind of thing. And so confessions were a very big part of what we did in police work. And I had occasion to solve 2 or 3 homicides, cold cases, and solve them through confessions as well. It was an important part of what we did.
Just kind of an overview of that process. Because obviously he went to court, he'd go to the Des Moines court.
So obviously we booked him, a warrant was issued, we went to preliminary, and then, as I recall, and I don't remember much about the preliminary, but I do remember the trial. Now here's some very interesting things we'll kind of touch on, and then later you'll see where they're significant. The first trial we went to were on Barbara Sue because it happened the year before, not a full year, but it happened November 27th, 62, and this is March 63. So we went to trial just a few weeks after the arrest. They apparently moved things along a little quicker back in those days. During the trial, Barbara Sue identified him in the courtroom. She told her story. I got up and told what happened, and we had a verbal confession. We did not ask him to give a written confession to that crime. First off, that wasn't the crime I was investigating, but secondly, we did not want to mix cases. So we don't talk about this case over here when we're just talking about this case when we're going to trial, or we think we'll go to trial, because it will, cloud the picture. So our case is strictly, my case is strictly on Patricia. The confession is strictly on Patricia. However, in Barbara's case, he confessed at the very same time verbally and told us exactly what happened. I think I left out a little point, and that was we brought, before I'll go back, we brought both of the ladies into the room with Miranda, okay? And we asked him to speak, and we asked him his name. He told us, what his name was, and we asked him another question. And then, probably a mistake on my part, I don't know, but we asked Miranda, do you recognize this lady? And he said yes, and he recognized the lady, and he said so, and he talked about it. He talked about actually what happened to the person, both of them, individually. So anyway.
In the interview room?
Yeah, that
okay.
was not at the trial. That
right.
was right after he confessed. Now we're back to the trial. He was convicted of robbery. He was given 20 to 25 years state prison. He did have an extensive record. And about a week after that trial, that was a very short trial, didn't take long for the jury to go out and determine guilt when everything pointed to him. About a week later, we went to the second trial. That was the case that I was working. And Patricia's trial, it was somewhat of a repeat of the first trial. And so I testified, Patricia testified, Bill Young testified. The case was presented. Once again, we had a very quick trial and a very quick verdict. Once again, he was given 20 to 25 years in prison to run consecutively, not concurrently, 2 different cases. Now he's gone away, or he's going away, and so at this point, I'm finished with the case. So I don't think anything more about it. I've got a whole caseload to worry about, and I've got more crimes to try to solve. Shortly after this, myself and Dick Golden were appointed the first homicide team the Phoenix Police Department ever had. But that was only kind of like a temporary assignment. It was just Seymour Nealis said, I'm going to put you 2 guys and you're going to be the homicide detectives. That's all you're going to handle. So anyway, that was kind of interesting. I did that for a while, solved a few cases that were interesting cases. But that's, I didn't think any more about it. We arrested him, we sent him to prison, and now that was over.
During the trial, was the written confession that he made, was that entered in?
Oh, absolutely, yes, it was entered.
Okay.
During the trial, his attorney was a court-appointed attorney. I believe his name was Alvin Moore. He did ask me a question, and probably in hindsight, I didn't answer it very well. But during this trial, he asked me, when you brought Ernie to the police station, was he in your custody? Without thinking deeply about this question, and I'm thinking at that time that, yeah, he was in the car with us. He came to the police department. We had him in the interrogation room. I said, yes, and that's all, yes. Now later, that was somewhat significant because the Supreme Court decided that he was arrested because of that one word.
Statement of custody.
Yeah, because he asked me if he was in custody, and my response was yes, but I wasn't thinking in terms of arrest. If he'd asked me, was he under arrest, I'd have said no. But I wasn't the smartest dude there, with a year as a detective and 5 years as a policeman.
Sounds like you did very well. After the trial was complete and he was sent off to prison,
Yes.
and you went back to your routine detective work, if it's routine, and then on to the Supreme Court. Obviously, it elevated to that level. Can you give
Yes.
us a little background on
Well,
that?
it was appealed. It was appealed to the state Supreme Court, and the confession, the other issue of attorney, because one was on the Sixth Amendment and the other was the Fifth Amendment, was appealed to the state Supreme Court. The conviction was upheld, and it was stated that, you know, you didn't have to tell a person of his rights to remain silent. And frankly, in my opinion, having read the Constitution and the amendments, they weren't talking about a time of arrest. They were talking about a time of trial. You know, you could have a witness, or you would not be a witness against yourself, a witness otherwise at point of trial. You could have an attorney for your defense. Again, that's happens to be a time of trial. So it didn't even apply to police departments in the interpretation of the day, which was what our forefathers wrote. So I went about my business. I became a sergeant and was now back in patrol as a squad sergeant. A couple years go by, and these appeals, I'm not even sure I knew of them, because you don't testify, they go on the record only. And so things happen, and you know, that case is long over and forgotten, and you don't pay too much attention. You're not following it, so to speak. So then I hear that it's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. And so now I know that the case has gone further up. I was confident at that time that we didn't do anything wrong. We followed police procedure at the time. It was upheld by the Supreme Court of Arizona and also been held by the District 9 court. You have to appeal to the district level, and that was upheld there, and then it goes on to the Supreme Court. So the next thing I hear is they overturned it along with 3 other cases. To give you a background on what happened with the Supreme Court, they appealed 4 cases. Miranda happened to have the lowest number of the 4 cases. The reason it's called Miranda, otherwise it would have been called the name of one of the other defendants. Miranda had the low number, so it became the Miranda decision. The cases were appealed on the basis of the Sixth Amendment, right to an attorney. And the reason it was appealed and the Supreme Court was going to listen to this is because in 1964, a year after I had arrested Miranda and he was convicted, there was a case called Escobedo, quite a well-known case. That case, I believe, was in Chicago, but he was in the police department. His attorney was in the police department. He was demanding to see his client. It may have been a homicide. The police would not let his attorney see the client, Escobedo. So that went before the Supreme Court. I don't know when the crime occurred. It went before the Supreme Court in '64. The Supreme Court overturned that case on the strength of the Sixth Amendment right to an attorney. Now, that particular case caused a little confusion in law enforcement circles and in the Justice Department. So the Supreme Court was now looking to expand what they had said on that case. And so they then agreed to take these 4 different cases from different parts of the country. In a way, you kind of already had made up their mind, hadn't they? They knew what they were going to listen to. The cases were taken before the Supreme Court by John Flynn and John Frank, both attorneys. John Flynn was a very well-known criminal attorney in the state of Arizona. I believe Frank wrote the petition and Flynn did the arguing. Now, when you go before the Supreme Court, you only have about 30 minutes to do your case. Now, of course, there's 4 different cases there. So Flynn, and this was appealed on the Sixth Amendment, and without any indication that they were going to bring in the Fifth Amendment, Flynn on his own brought this up, that he was interrogated and had been forced to be a witness against himself in violation of the Constitution, Fifth Amendment. The Supreme Court just jumped right on that. They liked that. That wasn't why the appeal started, but they liked it. So they wrote the opinion. Earl Warren himself, who was known to be quite liberal, and there was a 5-4 decision in favor of overturning it. There were 4 justices who had their heads screwed on right, and there were 5 that didn't, in my opinion. So anyway, they did overturn the case. Earl Warren wrote the decision. In the court reporter, it was about 61 pages written. There was less than 4 pages devoted to those 4 different crimes, less than a page, less than 2 pages each to each individual crime. The rest of this whole long decision dealt with a lot of other things like past practices, you know, like people using bright lights, rubber hoses. He quoted from Imbaugh's book on
During the
interrogation. And they went into all kinds of details about all the abuses that the police were using to extract confessions. Well, you just heard what happened. There was no abuse. In this case, I don't know about the other 3, I didn't follow them. But interesting to note that all 4 cases were retried and all 4 cases reconvicted. But I've got something to talk about on the reconviction of Ernest Miranda on that. So anyway, the decision came back. Now, Robert Corbin, county attorney, Maurice Berger, his chief deputy, county attorney, we're going to retry the case because it's overturned, but that doesn't mean he walks free. Ernest Miranda never got out of prison until he served his time. They wanted to talk to me because I was going to be a witness, obviously, the investigating officer. So I talked to the 2 attorneys, and they wanted me to be with them throughout the trial. Otherwise, I think they call it voir dire. They weren't going to exclude me from testimony. I would be at the prosecutor's table as an assistant. During and before the trial started, and we were viewing only one case, and this is where it becomes kind of interesting. Patricia's case went before the Supreme Court. Barbara's case did not. Barbara confessed at the very same time, at the same interview, but her confession was legal. It was not overturned. Miranda's confession to Patricia was now overturned. That's kind of significant because, you see, he never got out of jail because he was still in jail on the other confession, which was legal. The one confession was illegal, one wasn't, simply because of the difference in time, and simply because an oversight on the ACLU and John Flynn and John Franks probably didn't even know about this other case, or if they did, maybe they didn't feel it was significant, but that was not in the appeal process. So only Patricia's case was the Arizona case. I was at the county attorney's office, and I asked Bob Corbin if they had talked to Twyla Hoffman. The response was, well, couldn't find her. She's on the witness list, but we don't know where she is. She no longer lives on Mariposa. Well, that was a rental house. You know, you wouldn't even expect her to live there. And that's where they just quit looking. So I said to the 2 attorneys, you know, I don't know what she might have to say, but, you know, she's not married to Ernest Miranda. She was just a girlfriend. They did have a baby, though, by Ernie. She had a baby by Ernie. I said, I think if you would go to the senior Miranda's residence in Mesa, and they're good people and, you know, good citizens, and I'll bet you they know where their grandchild is. And so they sent an investigator, a county attorney investigator over, and they talked to him, and sure enough, they knew where Twyla was living and working. She was working at the Mesa General Hospital. So we called her and asked if we could interview her concerning being a witness, but we don't know what she's got to say, really. She agrees to the interview. Maurice Berger and Bob Corbin and myself went over there, and on the way over they told me they wanted me to talk to her, handle the interview, since I had already had some contact with her, which was rather hostile, I might add. At this point, she, you know, at the trial and so forth later. So we got there and we met her in the lobby. I conducted the interview. I asked her if she knew who I was. She did remember me. And so after introductions, we asked her if she could tell us anything about what she knew of these cases involving Ernest. And here's the funny part. Yes, she did. She said she knew about it. She had gone to visit Ernie when he was in the county jail awaiting the trial. She had gone a couple of times, or several times. She felt that he was her husband, even though they were never married. She felt common law. She had a baby by Ernest. And as one of her visits, she was talking to Ernie, and he confessed that he knew about or did this particular crime. And here's what made it a little bit funny. He asked her if she would go see Patricia, take the baby with her, and tell Patricia, if you will not testify in my trial, tell Patricia that when I get out of jail, I will marry her. Now think about that.
Whoa.
He's telling his girlfriend, who thinks she is the wife, basically,
Right.
and he's already telling her, yes, I did the crime, and go out, ask the victim, to drop charges, and I will marry her.
The victim.
Yes.
That's
Ask the
funny.
victim.
Yeah,
So, Twyla didn't think much of that idea.
I would think not.
So anyway, after he got sent off to prison and he was gone for a long time, relations ended, and she no longer had any feelings for him. And so we made sure that she wasn't having any kind of grudges against him either. So we asked her if she had any kind of grudge against Ernest. And she said, oh, absolutely not. I've made a new life for myself, and he's out of it.
Right.
No hard feelings. Next question.
Well,
Would you testify to this? The answer, yes. We went to trial. His confession to me was out. Written confession was out. The identification was out because they said it wasn't positive. Twyla got on the witness stand. She told her story, and what a brave lady, because John Flynn was a great attorney, and he just tried to rake her over the coals. Now, one thing that he tried to bring up was the fact that they were married. And I pointed out to Corbin that they weren't married. And he said Flynn said it's privileged communications, what he told his wife. Corbin says, well, they're not married. Flynn says, well, they're living together, the common law. And I told Corbin whether he knew this or not, but I did tell him because I'd been teaching this particular class in criminal law at the academy and at Phoenix College. I told him that there is no common law in Arizona. You can live with somebody 100 years, it doesn't make you married. I'm not trying to sound like a hero, I just happen to know this. But I even told Corbin the name of the decision in the state law, in the appeal in the decision, that's in law books, because I'd used this information in my class. He cited this to the judge looked it up, overruled Lynn's objection that she could testify, that she was not married. She wasn't an agent of the state. That's another issue. We didn't send her in to get a confession. We didn't even know that happened. So she wasn't working for us. She had no obligation whatsoever by the Supreme Court ruling to give him any kind of warning against incriminating himself. So that is kind of an ironic little thing. We convicted him, or I should say maybe she convicted him, for confession. The Supreme Court said no confession, we're overturning it. Well, it got upheld on the original sentence.
In another action today, the court let stand the second conviction of a man whose name is on one of the court's milestone decisions, Ernest Miranda. 3 years ago, the court overturned the first kidnap-rape conviction of the Arizona truck driver on grounds that police improperly obtained his confession. The ruling strengthened the rights of suspects. Miranda was tried again, and today the court upheld his conviction and 20 to 30-year sentence.
They did change it, though, that he could serve concurrently with the other trial. There's so many things about this case that are not understood and have not ever been heard before, because if you only read the Supreme Court decisions, you would come away with a complete false picture of what actually happened. In fact, on one other comment on the Supreme Court, and it's just a personal thing, because I know it's not legal, but the Constitution prevents passing a law after the deed is done. It's called ex post facto. In effect, the Supreme Court does that all the time. We didn't have guidelines in 1963 that said anything about warning people of their rights one way or the other. In fact, it was just the opposite, you know. We didn't, and it was okay, and it was upheld by the courts time and time again. So we're, in effect, flying blind, as you might say. The Supreme Court says, you were bad back in 1963. This is 1966, now 3 years later, and you're saying, you didn't do a good job. You didn't do what you should have been doing. Well, how were we to know what we should have been doing? So they passed this decision, of course, which in effect becomes law. And, you know, how do we deal with these kinds of things in the police department? We do the very best we can with what we have at the time. And then we have to go back sometimes and say, well, the Supreme Court decided that what we were doing wasn't the way it should be done. So that's kind of my feelings on this. And of course, you can understand where I'm coming from, the way I feel about it.
With regards to the change in department policies, there was a time where we went from not advising them to advising suspects of their constitutional rights, and we did that by the usage of a card. Can you tell me how that came about?
It was a time of great confusion. I will tell you this, that when we first started to try to apply the guidelines that the Supreme Court had issued, it was an overreaction in police departments at the very beginning. We were telling everybody before we talked to them about anything, for the most part, their Miranda rights and reading them the card. And for a while, they were sending a county attorney over on our serious cases. And I was present in this case when I heard the county attorney just absolutely talk this guy out of speaking to us. Now, he's supposed to be on our side, but you know, he warned this guy and re-warned him and re-warned him, and finally this dumb guy, like, you know, kind of came on.
Well, Carroll, we were talking about the Miranda card and a little bit how it came about now. Tell us about the card itself. The officers are starting to use it, and then eventually I heard Miranda was actually signing cards and making some money outside the court and on the street.
Yes, I don't recall the exact time that we actually printed a card, and my recollection of this event was it was not very long after the decision, because not everybody could remember exact words we were supposed to tell a suspect. So they came up with a small card that the officers were issued and they could carry with them. They would read the rights off of the card and make sure that the suspect or the individual being interviewed understood his rights and agreed to that. It wasn't very long after the decision. It may have been months or maybe a year, but I don't even think it was very long before we came up with that. I might go into what happened to Miranda before we actually talk about the cards. He spent 11 years in prison. He got out on good behavior, on a 20 to 25 year sentence, which was combined with the other case, so he did them concurrently. He spent his full time, except he was now on probation, of course. When he got out, there was several police incidents where he had been stopped, and there was some rumors about his illegal activities, and once he was stopped or some violation, there was a weapon in the car, a pistol. It was under the seat. He claimed it wasn't his. There was some discussion about that being a felony. However, they couldn't make a positive connection, so he still continued to have a shady past after the 11 years he spent in prison. He was a character around the Deuce area, which was the Skid Row area. Phoenix also, in my opinion, and from what I was told by the old-timers, got its name from the fact it was the produce area. They shortened the name to the Deuce area. He would get a hold of the officers when he could see them on the street and ask them if he could have some of their cards, the Miranda warning cards. He'd introduce himself, tell them who he was, and would they mind giving him a card or two, and he'd sign the card for him. And he would sign these cards and he would sell them usually for like $1, an autographed card with his name, you know, written across it. I never got one of his cards. In fact, I had no contact with the guy except during trials and the investigation. So I was never privileged to get a card from him. But anyway, he did use those cards to his advantage, and like I said, he probably made more money off this case than I ever did. He didn't really last too long after he got out of prison, 11 years in prison and hanging around the Deuce, and he was reported to be involved in some criminal activity. He was involved in a situation at the Amapola bar, and I think that was at 233 South 2nd Street. He was involved with a couple other individuals. They were in a card game. A fist fight ensued, didn't last long, and then broke up, and Ernie went into the bathroom, and one of the fellows, I think his name was Fernando, and he went over and got this knife out of this guy's pocket. He brought the knife back over to the other person, who was going by the name of Marino, and he says, "Here, finish it with this." So when Ernie came out of the bathroom, he confronted him. They struggled over the knife, and he stabbed Ernie through the heart. Ernie died on that dirty floor in the Amapola bar. Had a very short life, relatively speaking, anyway. He kind of ended like almost, you'd say, by the way he lived his life. Not a very good ending. After the homicide, the two suspects immediately fled. During the process of interviewing people at the bar, they thought they might have a lead on him. They told the detectives where they thought this guy might be staying, in one of the flop houses. They picked the guy up. He did have a cut over his bridge of his nose, but they kind of thought it was an old wound. They brought him to the police department. They read him his rights. He gave them a name. They asked him about whether he was in the fight. He said that he was not in the fight. With a different name that he gave him, or a name that he gave him, apparently had no ID. And the fact that they didn't have very much to hold him on, even though they had read him his rights, they released him. And then later, they found out that he was in fact the suspect by another witness that had more information on him. And so when they went back to find this individual, lo and behold, he was no longer there. What a surprise. A warrant was issued under his real name, not the one that he gave the police that night. He never was found, to my knowledge. The warrant was never served. That kind of is the story on what happened to Ernest Miranda.
Well, Carroll, it's really interesting that the man that is involved in this, Ernest Miranda, has the suspect eventually read his Miranda rights for the very person that he killed.
Yeah, that's always ironic,
Yeah,
isn't it?
very ironic.
It was my pleasure to share the story.
Well, again, we really appreciate the time, and it was very interesting.
Well, I hope you did find it interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
Got a couple of very ironic situations that occurred. It's a good story.